And welcome on into a bonus edition of Still Enrolled, a Big Ten podcast. Ryan Hickey, Brian Tripp with you here. But joining us on this extra special edition is Yogi Roth. You've seen him. You've heard him. Does a tremendous job on Big Ten Network as an analyst. Also host of the Y Option podcast as well. And owner, as you can see if you're watching on YouTube, of a tremendous backdrop. Yogi, what's going on, man? How are you?
It's all DIY, man. Okay, this is just so you know.
Even more impressive. Not green screen or anything, huh?
No. I was inspired by a singer-songwriter out here. Her name is Kate Vogel. And she did like a DIY of like her setup. And her husband is one of my best friends. His name's Brett Hughes. Big-time linebacker coming out of Ohio, by the way. Went and played lacrosse. 3-time All-American at UVA. Played with Andy Katzenmoyer. I think he was kind of comped to him way back in the day. Anywho, just for some Big Ten love. Yeah, she helped me kind of inspire it. So me and my two sons and I, we painted it. We hammered it into the wall. And let's hope it doesn't fall. So I appreciate it.
What's the one must read on that bookshelf behind you?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, this is my gift. My wife is over there. I hope she's not hearing me right now because this is part of her holiday gift. It's a new book. It's called 365 Questions by Brett Ledbetter. He is just a rock star. I'll show it to you. This is it. I've been giving it to coaches and people that I love. It's really cool. It's Brett is he coaches a lot of coaches in college football. Go check it out, man. Like you open up any page and it's like an amazing question. So like here, let me just open one up. It says, what's the best lesson you've learned as you were healing from your hardest breakup? Right? Or what in your life do you wish you could see with fresh eyes and why? Like it's just really cool questions. And for CEOs and leaders and head coaches, I've heard from a lot of them that actually use this book when they're trying to figure out messaging for a week, right? You go through an up and down season. So right now this one, but I cannot not plug like 5-Star QB, a book that I co-wrote with Joey Roberts about quarterback play. So get that one on Amazon for your holidays as well.
Yogi, let's start. We were both on the field and at Lucas Oil Stadium for the Big Ten championship game on Saturday. I'm not sure anyone expected it to play out as it did. You knew it was two really good teams, but for it to be a high-scoring 45-37 affair, Penn State just not going down without a fight, and Oregon proving why they're the number one team in the country. Unstoppable on offense with Tez Johnson and Dylan Gabriel. What were your impressions of the game? Again, I thought it would be tight, but I'm not sure anyone thought it would be that high scoring of a game.
No doubt. Yeah. It was an incredible game. My first ever Big Ten championship game. You know, I've gone to obviously the Pac-12 one since its inception. This was cool because you had these two fan bases who are going to have to travel a bunch. You knew they were going to the playoff. And I think at least a narrative that I had heard a lot, even at the Fan Fest, they did a 2-hour pregame show on Big Ten Network around that. It was how many people are going to be in the stadium. And to see those two fan bases rise up and show up to me was just phenomenal. Like it had everything that a championship atmosphere at any level of championship football would desire to have. I thought it had. I think my biggest takeaway from the Big Ten in year one of fully covering this league is one, teams eliminate possessions. I called probably 6 games this year where at the end of the first quarter, each team had the ball once. And it's a low-scoring affair. They lean on the run game, and the better team just kind of lean on you, right? That has been a lot of, I thought, Penn State throughout this season, Ohio State this season, and other teams in seasons past that you guys all know even better than I do right now. So we didn't have that, though. We had an explosive offense. We had great display at quarterback. And my second biggest takeaway from the league was that I thought the quarterback play overall in totality was pretty average in the Big Ten, especially coming from where I came from. We saw two of, if not two of the top 3 quarterbacks in the Big Ten. Curtis Rourke would be the other one. I thought Drew Aller just showed up. And here's a Penn State team that everybody talked about, 1-23 versus top 5 AP team since the year 2000. Can James Franklin get over the hump? The CFP is built in the expanded playoff for a team like Penn State, et cetera, et cetera. And when they're down 28-10, when they're down multiple times in this game, you're thinking, here come the Ducks. And they just responded. So I loved that and the way they did it with explosive offense, with creative offense. I mean, it was a clinic from Andy Kotelnicki and Will Stein all game long.
Penn State really competed, Yogi. But obviously Oregon wins the game. They're 13-0. For those that don't know, Yogi was covering the Pac-12. So you know this Oregon team really well as they transition from the Pac-12 to the Big Ten. And you look at this year, Yogi, right, where they're the only team in FBS that's undefeated. And Tripp and I have talked a lot about taking care of business and how so many teams this year did not do that. Oregon's the only team that said that they won every game. And you look at, especially in the Big Ten title game, how their offense was able just to keep on executing. Dylan Gabriel, anytime you thought there was some pressure on him, boom, just get the ball quick, make a play, and then Oregon offense would take off. Watching Oregon this year, what makes them different, in your opinion, compared to every other team where they haven't had a stumble? They haven't had a bad loss. They've played 2 top 5 teams, won both, one at a neutral site. What makes Oregon, in your opinion, different than really every other team in the country so far this year?
Well, I think it's just that. I mean, I remember back in the day, I was on the staff at SC with Pete Carroll, and to go undefeated, it is so hard. I reference that all the time because I think unless you're like in it, it's hard to sometimes recognize like that fight, that standard, and really the psychology around not making sure your team is playing tight, right? I think we've seen in the Big Ten this year, whether it's Ohio State at times or even Penn State at times, I thought some of the premier brands have played tight. I think for Oregon and how Dan Lanning has coached the mental side of this game has been a clinic, right? We've seen it in all their YouTube videos about the team out west and the doc series they provide. But really, when you sit down and you talk to them, and I was up there last week doing a piece that aired on Big Ten Network, where we talked about like how he plots out, in the preseason, how he plans each week on what he'll try to utilize as a motivator for his team. And I think that it's just so purposeful. And I think back to my time with Coach Carroll, it was the same way, right? We didn't have the dynamic, production quality that Oregon has now, but it was very similar in messaging and really getting your team that when they perform, they can perform as we would say back then, is like, can you perform on the razor's edge? Be willing to fall over, but know that like you've got to be free and you've got to have this peace of mind. You have to play with joy right when you're standing over that edge, and you can't be afraid of falling. And that's what I see with Oregon. You look at the way that he coaches, going forward on 4th downs, fake punts, you name the game and the play, there's been one throughout the storybook season that they've had. And what I believe has led him to take those chances is not bravado. It's he knows his team can handle the inverse when they don't get it on the fake field goal, when they don't get it on a trick play. And I think that, to me, is when a coach really has a handle on the pulse of his team. And the pulse of this team is one that is explosive, is physical, and they play right up to the edge. They're not reckless. They play right up to the edge. And I think the best teams, they're going to have to do that if they want to go on a gauntlet here and win 3 or 4 straight games to win a national championship.
Real quick perspective for me, and I'm standing at the 10-yard line on the opposite sideline and the opposite end of the field from where Oregon's set to run out of the tunnel. And they have one of their videographers, and I'll tell you, the rig that he was using to watch him try to pick it up and get that shot with his camera from 100 yards away, it had to be an 80-pound camera. So the cinematic value that they're putting in and the time and effort and money that they're putting into the cameras and gear to get some of the footage and content that they have is unbelievable. Yogi, you make an interesting point there, because I think that bravado, Penn State fans were hoping to see that from their team in the Ohio State game. And it just felt like another one of those close losses, and they didn't push the right buttons to win a tight game. James Franklin, it appeared in that Minnesota game with the fake punt, with the aggressiveness of ending it on your own terms on 4th down, had a shift in the way he typically would coach traditionally in a game like that. I think it's hard to get a gauge on it in the Big Ten championship, but because of how they fought, you almost feel like they continued on that trend. Is that something that you think Penn State then, as they go into the playoffs, to get over that hump, to change that narrative, that's something that you can look at a parallel there between James Franklin and Dan Lanning?
Yeah, well, I think to the point of how challenging it is to be undefeated, I think that once you lose your first game, it allows you to exhale a little bit. I think it's a good thing for teams, because I think that it's almost an easier path. And there's Ohio State after they lost to Oregon. I think you saw them play really free in that Penn State game. I thought the inverse of Penn State. In the Ohio State game, I thought there were times where it just looked a little tight just from watching it back on tape. And then from that moment on, to your point, whether it was at Minnesota or in the game against Maryland or even in the Big Ten championship game, they were cutting it loose. And I love that. And I think that's part of a coach's job is to navigate those moments when you hit those buttons. And now I think it's going to be even more unique because performance anxiety is real. Like we feel it right now on your show. I feel it when I call the game. How do you navigate it? That's the question, right? A psychologist that I love, a guy named Michael Gervais, whose book is behind me too, he would say that instead of saying I'm feeling nervous, you would say I'm switched on right now. You're just changing how you talk to yourself. And here we enter this playoff world that we've never seen it before. And when I talk to people at like the FCS level or talk to anybody in the NBA, when they go to like playoff basketball or they get in the playoffs, it's just a different intensity. So I'm so curious now in these opening round games, whether it's the early one in Happy Valley or the one in South Bend on the Friday night, or of course the night game in Columbus, how do these coaches navigate that? Because it is at first. You don't have, like, you can't comp this to anything because you have nothing to comp to it. So what do? To me, you just make it the next game. Like, I'm not a fan of this is the biggest game in the world. We've got to go beat our rival. I love the rivalries that exist for fans, especially in the Big Ten, because I feel like there's like a bucket or an award every single weekend, which is awesome in these conference games. But I don't think within your team room, you can make them any bigger. And I think that's going to be a unique dance for coaches now, because what are they navigating as we talk? They're navigating the portal. They're navigating who they're adding. They're navigating tough conversations. They're navigating new NIL deals. And oh, by the way, you got to go play. So I just think that is fascinating. I would love to sit down with every coach among all 12 teams and just have that deep, confidential conversation of like, how are you doing it? Because I think everybody's probably got a little bit of their own flavor, which they should.
A question or an answer I'd love to hear to that question is from Ryan Day. Because you talk about, I feel like that's a perfect segue here to Ohio State. We talk about performance anxiety and maybe playing tight. We've seen Ohio State, I would say, play pretty loosely every game up until Michigan, right? The big one, the rivalry game. And obviously that did not go well. What do you like when you watch that game versus what you watch for Ohio State, the other 11 games, Yogi? Do you expect to see when they play Tennessee here in just about a week and a half or so, do you expect them to kind of come out and maybe pick up where they left off from the Michigan game? Or do you look at that as an anomaly? And look, Ohio State's played some high-level football. They've beaten two top 5 teams, played 3 overall. What do you expect from Ohio State here as they get set for a playoff game after coming off the most deflating loss they've had in a long time?
Yeah, well, I think a couple things. One is I referenced that first takeaway I have from the Big Ten is how teams just lean on you. I mean, you go back and whether it's I'm trying to remember here, like Purdue, Northwestern, Indiana. I mean, these are all like 7-0, 0-0 after the first quarter, right? Mm-hmm. Or kind of early into the second quarter. Indiana, it's 7-0. I was just with Kurt Cignetti on Sunday. Like, it's 7-0 and they drop a punt. And then it's 14, and then they get a punt return. It's 21. And like, Ohio State to me is just leaned on teams all year, and then one of their backs breaks one of the receivers breaks one. So I'll be really curious how this game starts to me, because it is at home, right? And I actually went back and watched his press conference after the CFP was announced on Sunday, just to hear what his tone was like, and he looked refreshed. You know, he's very aware. Like, I've known Ryan for a long time, and I think he's a phenomenal coach. 66-10, and I know what that game means to that fan base, or at least I'm learning about that in real time with a little bit more intimacy. And I think that this will be a team that will be able to hit the reset button. I think they're mature enough. I think that in this era of college football, when you usually would have, the similar 3 goals, beat your rival, win the conference, win the natty. Now it's like a totally different world, because usually if you didn't do the first 2, you had no shot at the third one. Now you got a shot. So I think it's a total reset for this team. He's got a great pulse on his program and the players there. It's player-led versus coach-fed. So I expect them to come out and cut it loose. The challenge is, though, that to the point of those recent games, they haven't been that team. Like, they haven't been that team like Oregon that jumps on you. I think Oregon's like first half scoring margin, I think they're up is like 21 or 28. Like, it's something ridiculous. They average like 240, 250 yards in the first half. That has not necessarily been Ohio State, especially in the first quarter, right? As I referenced, 0-0, 7-0. Like, so what will this thing feel like? I don't know. And I hope, and I know, I would imagine that what's being said to the players is it's not about how we start, it's about how we finish. I've always been a fan of that. Whenever I hear a coach say we got to jump out on, we got to get going early, I worry about that. I really do. Now, I'm trained from the Pete Carroll school of thought, which is like him chanting, can you win the game in the first quarter? No. Can you win the game in the second quarter? No. Can you win the game in the third? No. Can you win the game in the fourth quarter? Hell yeah. Like, go on YouTube and you'll find him doing that countless times. So I'm schooled in that, but I'll be curious how they navigate the early 15 minutes against a Tennessee offense that has a dynamic quarterback. We'll see. But that will be the thing of his team being able to be okay with whatever happens early on in that game versus, oh, here we go again. Because I think they're used to kind of slowly leaning on teams and then pulling away.
Yogi, you mentioned you were in Bloomington, which first, I know you were well taken care of down there by a good friend in Greg Campbell. And then second, Indiana was the darling and Cinderella of college football. They were the story. Ever since the loss to Ohio State, they've kind of flown under the radar. They got all the help they needed that day from the other results across the country. And they're just sitting there as cruising into the college football playoff, knowing all they had to do was beat lowly Purdue at the end of the season. What are vibes like right now in Bloomington? Because here they are, huge story still for Curt Cignetti to take them to the college football playoff, but they're on the road and a little bit of an afterthought with everything that's happened in Columbus the last couple of weeks, and obviously with Oregon and Penn State playing an instant classic on Saturday.
Well, I think they're probably exactly where they want to be to a certain degree, right? They're kind of laying right there. I think you look at their side of the bracket and they have, I would argue, as good a path to everything as anybody, right? They would have loved a home game, but I was sitting in that facility when the announcement was made and I heard a cheer, right? When, of course, they saw their school's name, but I think also when they saw the matchup, right? And now they get to go, I think it's 198 miles away, is South Bend. And they get to play a team in their own state with, there's a rivalry of sorts. I know they don't play every year or every other year, but it's still a team right down the road. Curt Cignetti will have his program clearly prepared for that. I think they're two teams that mirror one another, Notre Dame and Indiana. We look at their path, the schedule, the teams they've blown out. I mean, neither one of them have had the most challenging of schedules all season long. So I think it's a really cool matchup. And if they're able to get past that and get that Friday night win, are they going up against a team that doesn't have a quarterback? Right? You just start playing it out and you're like, if you take all the emotion and the brands away, you're like, hey, Indiana's kind of handled everybody. You go back and watch that Ohio State game, and as I referenced, like they drive right down the field, feeling pretty good about life heading into the half, and then boom, 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 and it's a rout. And I think that experience will only help them regarding the noise in South Bend, right? Like they struggled, I thought, and Curt Cignetti referenced it, with the silent count, with the crowd. They've been addressing that, I've been told, ever since then, and really dedicating time to corrections from that game and also preparation for the variety of opponents they expected. But this is a team that I think is really well positioned and wouldn't be shocked if they want to run. Same thing for Notre Dame. I think the winner of that game is going to be one of the more intriguing storylines and teams to track throughout this playoff, and wouldn't be surprised if either one of them won multiple games in this portion of the season.
Last question for me, Yogi. It has to do with the rest of the Big Ten. Right? We talked about the college football playoff teams in it. Look around the rest of the Big Ten here. Obviously, we saw Indiana this year jump up unexpectedly. When you kind of look at now the future of the conference, was there a team that maybe is under the radar right now? Maybe we're not looking at them in a highlight that you saw and said, you know what, man, maybe this year was not the year, but boy, in a year or two, this could be a team that everyone's talking about here. Is there a team that kind of maybe in a year or two could creep up here and be a surprise team, if you will, or be better than maybe people anticipate?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, so much about these super leagues is almost like who you don't play, right? I think to a certain degree in the season, Illinois is going to be the Rutgers of this past year, right? Rutgers was kind of the sexy darling pick in the preseason. Illinois is going to be that. They got a chance to get to 10 wins. I mean, what a season. You look at their losses and they're clearly, call it really good losses, if you will, in the games they played. And there's some pretty quality wins. You go back and look at that Kansas game and look what Kansas did in the back end of the season. So they'll be that team. I think I got to go to the West Coast just because of what Washington was a year ago, right? They were playing in the national title. Jed Fish, he's got an NFL background and an NFL acumen. And they look at like their, call it salary cap, if you will, and you could say, hey, they got a $15 million to kind of go make some hay here in the portal. They didn't spend it all last year in year one. They got there in February of last year. They said, okay, let's try to patch this thing together. We know it's going to be a quote unquote, call it year zero to a certain degree. They got DeMond Williams, who will be top third of the league at quarterback could be really dynamic. And I believe in that coaching staff as much as any staff in this conference. I'd say them. And then I got to say SC too. I mean, I've been calling it a foundational year for them all year long in advance of the season. I didn't think they would only have 6 wins. I thought they'd sit around 8. Clearly 5 of their losses are by, was a combined 18 or 19 points. So I think it's a foundational year. I think if they can put a couple pieces together, which I think they will, I think the staff, unless they take a better job, like a head coaching job like Matt Enns did, became the head coach of Fresno State, they're going to stay together. I like the core group of players that they have. Jaden Mayava, they want to build that thing around him. Look forward to them catching a little bit of steam next year, because they're a couple plays away from having a completely different narrative, right? And we know them, much like all the other Blue Bloods. If you have a shot at this playoff, here comes the argument for you. So I'm really curious to watch those 2 teams out west. And even UCLA, I mean, Deshaun Foster got the job late as well. Made a bunch of changes. Tino Sinceri, fully expect that to be official as their new offensive coordinator. And you saw them kind of hit a little bit of a stride. They got to replace 40-plus seniors. How do they do that in this portal palooza that we sit in right now over the course of the next 2 weeks? I think will be huge for them.
I think you hit on so many things, and it's kind of big picture, but fell off the radar, and rightfully so this time of year. But you've obviously done it yourself. UCLA, USC, and Washington, I think, have combined 1 win when going on the road to the East here with it. I mean, is there something to make of it where travel really could be a significant impact for those West Coast teams? And then, the second part of it, at the start of the year, we're talking, the thought is Pac-12 teams are this finesse, speed, going to go up and down the field. I don't know that's entirely true for people who are around it all the time. How do you think those 4 schools adapted and fit within the Big Ten? Obviously, knowing that Oregon's the only team that ran the table and has wins over Ohio State, Penn State, and Michigan this year.
Yeah, sure. All right, so let's start with the travel. I think it's a thing for sure. I think the record would illuminate that. I also think that these new brands are exciting for the ones that have been in the Big Ten for a long time. So when you look at Washington going to Rutgers on a Friday night, and it's like a dance club in the stadium. And when I talk to coaches on that staff at UW, they're like, that place was crazy. I called a couple weeks later UCLA at Rutgers, where UCLA won on a Saturday afternoon. So I think it's also like the stage that you walk into. Yeah. USC goes to College Park, Maryland, and it's a big deal. And they have that game in hand, you're thinking, then here comes Mike Locksley's squad. So I think there's a part of that. And then I think you have to look at the teams they played, right? Washington going to Iowa. I mean, they weren't going to stop Caleb Johnson. It was a hard environment. UCLA and UW going to Penn State for either a whiteout or an early season game in Deshaun Foster's tenure. Like, I think you have to kind of net out at some of those, because I also see the inverse of UCLA went to Nebraska and won. And Nebraska was the coolest place I saw all season long as a broadcaster. That place was off the hook. And they went in and handled it, to be honest with you, like from an explosive standpoint, winning the line of scrimmage. So I think there's probably nuances to that. I've always felt like the West Coast teams going to call it the mid-level of the Big Ten was going to be scary, because it was already hard for those teams to go to Oregon State, going to Cal, going to Arizona. Like, it's always hard to get up for some of those, call it mid-tier teams. I thought you saw the same deal this year when those teams played those brands, and then they lost, right? Like, I called USC at Minnesota, and Minnesota, like, they might have played one of their better games of the season. That place is hard to play in. And they have no experience in going there. It's not like they've gone to Corvallis tons of times. They know what it's going to be like on third down. Like, they were all new. So I do think it's a thing. And I think over the course of time, we'll see if it balances itself out. I'm not really sure. I think on the second side, on the physicality, Oregon clearly can handle it. I mean, they're a Joe Moore Award winner or finalist again. I think for the other teams, I didn't think they were like blown off the field for the most part. Like, I didn't think it was a thing. I mean, I think even Washington probably personnel-wise was lower than SC and UCLA if you're kind of projecting at the next level, front seven, offensive line. But the style in which they played, I thought, was able to neutralize a lot of that. I don't think I ever turned on a film and was like, couldn't handle it, right? USC couldn't handle Michigan at the line of scrimmage. They weren't manhandled, right? Washington beat Michigan at home. So I think when you start looking at some of those things. The Nebraska front, I referenced UCLA, the SC game. I didn't think it was like as big of a thing. I think the biggest thing to me, right, like I said off the top, was the better teams lean on you. Like Iowa's going to give you one possession in the first quarter. Rutgers is going to give you one possession in the first quarter. I think that's the thing that when you talk to coaches, like, damn, we only had 9 possessions in the whole game. We only had 18 plays in the second half. That is the biggest thing that stood out. And that's what I think these teams out West have to match that, because that style of play is not going to change based on the majority of this league.
Then you had a championship game that had 150 plays, right?
Of course.
Right.
Yogi, this was a blast. We could do this for hours, just talk Big Ten football. Thank you so much for your time. This was a lot of fun and really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I love the title of your show. I think it's hilarious, man. So thanks for having me on. Happy to do it anytime, especially now in the postseason. We all have a little bit more time on our hands to focus in on some specific matchups.